Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We have MIRA's Chief of Staff, Sarang Sekhavat, is going to talk to us about mass deportation, from the PATRIOT Act to mass deportation, immigration in the security era. Please share your questions or thoughts in the comments, and we'll follow up if we can't answer them live. Sarang, I'm going to pass it to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As Laura said, I'm Sarang Sekhavat. I'm the Chief of Staff here at the MIRA Coalition. Of what we've seen, really the history kind of this century of how we've seen immigration really evolve and change into what we see today. And really, this starts. I mean, people say different things. Frankly, people have different opinions on this. A lot of folks could point to 1996 when we had things like MIRA pass that dramatically expanded the definition of aggravated felony, for example, and created so many classes of people who are under mandatory detention and mandatory deportation. You also, that same year, you had the Welfare Reform Act that took so many of our community members off of any kind of, the kind of assistance they need to get by in life. But the way I kind of look at it, and frankly, this is because this is when I got into this work, is really the post 9/11 era. I think 9/11 made a dramatic change in the way that we look at immigration and at immigration enforcement. I started getting into this work, summer of 2003. At that point, ICE and DHS had only been around for a couple of months. They were, Congress passed the law creating DHS and putting all the immigration enforcement functions within DHS in 2002, about a year after 9/11, and they began as agencies back in March of 2003. And to give you an idea of how new and sort of how confusing these things were, ICE wasn't called ICE back then. It was BICE. It was the Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. CBP was the Bureau of Customs and Border Protection. So these are all things that were still, even just the names of these agencies were being worked out back at that time. One of the big issues about what happened, of course, this is the Bush II era. This is George W. Bush, and there was really very little oversight when these agencies came into existence. No one really cared within government of what they were doing. They just saw them as necessary agencies for national security. The methods they used, the way that they treated people, even back then, was sort of ignored. No one really cared. And one of the main things we saw happening back then, and this was really what got me into this work, was a program called Special Registration. Special Registration started in September of 2002, so before these agencies even existed, and carried through into the Obama administration. And what Special Registration did was require men between the ages of 16 and 65 who were not citizens or green card holders and who were from one of a list of 25 countries to come and register with the federal government. Those 25 countries, by the way, 24 of which were Muslim majority, the other one was North Korea. The registration process itself was really horrific. I was doing this work in New York at the time, and just to give you an example, folks would talk about, we went in to register expecting it to be a short process. You're just supposed to go in, give some information to the government, spend, figured it'd probably take like a half hour or something like that. People would be bringing their kids in as they're, out and about in town trying to do what they need to do. And instead of going through a really quick process, they would wind up being shackled. And often it was a process that took all day. They're there with their kids, they're shackled, they're not allowed to get any food, can't even go to the bathroom. And this could be 10 or 12 hours of shackled to a bench. And I'm not just talking about, they're shackled together. They're not allowed to move. And this was the experience for thousands of people in New York and elsewhere around the country. We had 82,000 people. The last number I've seen was about 82,000 altogether who registered through this program. And about 13,000 were placed in removal proceedings. And one of the worst parts about this is they flat out lied. We've seen video of ICE officers or DHS officers, whatever, talking, coming and doing community presentations about special registration and how important it was. And they said, don't worry about it. Nothing's going to happen to you. You'll be fine. But what happened instead was all these people were placed in removal proceedings. And, some of the families that I saw at the time that were doing this kind of thing, there was one family in particular I remember who they had overstayed a visitor's visa. The reason they had come to the US was because their two little children, I think the older of them was 6, the younger was probably about 4 or 5, had serious developmental issues with their brains, microencephalopathy, if I'm pronouncing that right. Basically, their brains were not developing properly, and they'd come to the US for medical treatment and overstayed their visa because everyone overstayed their visa. And they were totally planning on going home once the medical treatment was done. But instead, the father was placed in detention. And, the whole family was at risk because of this. The kids couldn't get their medical attention because of everything that was going on. Saw another family who had, after the special registration and being placed in removal proceedings, they tried to go up to Canada to apply for asylum, actually, there. And unfortunately, they got into a car accident driving up there, and the mother was killed in the car accident. So these are not things that, these are issues that have real impact on real people. And of course, the whole idea behind special registration is supposed to be some kind of national security. Oh, let's catch the terrorists. But what idiot thinks that terrorists are going to register with the federal government? It's just an inane proposition. And the fact is that no one who went through special registration was ever convicted of any kind of terrorist activities. The Bush administration had tried to accuse, we've captured the X number of terrorists. But again, no one was ever actually convicted of any terrorist activities. The Obama administration had removed portions of the program, I was going to say fairly early on, but that's not really true, in the first term in 2011. But it wasn't until the very end of the second term that the Obama administration ended it completely. And it was interesting. I ran across a quote recently from the former New York Attorney General at the time, who said, and I'm quoting here, "We can't risk giving President-elect Trump the tools to create an unconstitutional religious registry." And my question to that is, well, what was it before? You're saying to create an unconstitutional religious registry. Wasn't it already that? And isn't that exactly what we were doing, is going after people because of their religion? In fact, well, I won't even get into that. So, we did see a few efforts by the Obama administration to create sort of a veneer of respectability for this. There always was, under the law that created DHS, there was an Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and they were fairly active and, engaged with the advocates a lot, frankly. But the problem was it was also a toothless agency. You could report all the civil rights and civil liberties violations you wanted to them, and they were more than happy to put these down. And they could talk to ICE and they could talk to CBP and basically complain about these issues, but in the end there was nothing they could really do to change anything about it. And similarly, we had an ICE ombudsman or a DHS ombudsman who, again, under the Obama administration, really good in terms of engaging with the advocates and wanting to know what was going on. But at the end of the day, it made very little difference as a practical matter for the folks who, were being detained, deported, and all of that. And we saw a huge change in that under the Trump administration. While it wasn't so much that they stopped engaging with us, they were still willing to engage with us. But what happened was they started inviting all the anti-immigrant groups to these meetings. So we used to have regular meetings in DC with ICE, which would include CRCL, ICE leadership, the ombudsman, all these folks. And it was, we'd have all the national advocates there. Me and others representing the state coalitions would be attending these meetings. But eventually the Trump administration rather quickly actually started inviting the anti-immigrant advocates like FAIR, like Numbers USA, like the Center for Immigration Studies. And, it was basically, once we realized that that's what they were going to do, we stopped attending these. We realized there was no point, that this was what they were going after was these anti-immigrant policies. And they were, they wanted to invite these people to counter us, basically. And so what we've seen, the Biden administration was a little bit better, obviously, than the Trump administration. But one of the things we've constantly also seen in this space is that when you have administrations that are pushing for immigration reform, and this goes back to the Bush administration, this includes the Obama administration, this includes the Biden administration, certainly not the Trump administration, what they've done to try and build support for immigration reform has been to increase enforcement. This is why we called, for example, Obama the deporter in chief. By the way, that was a term coined by the ED of our Illinois coalition. Of course, Obama, being from Illinois, had a relationship with them beforehand and was really upset about the fact that we were calling him that. But it was true. Obama had set records for deportations. And the real problem with that kind of thing is what we see often happening is that they think that the only way they can get the right on board with immigration reform is to show that they're serious about immigration enforcement. But that immigration enforcement piece is actually part of the compromise to be made around immigration reform. So basically what happened was that the administrations who were pushing for immigration reform were already giving the house away. They were already giving the right everything they wanted, or at least some of what they wanted, without us getting anything in return. And so, the right never saw any reason to actually negotiate on trying to get immigration reform. Why bother? You're increasing enforcement anyway. That's what we want. And so that's what we saw. And similarly, always increases in enforcement funding from Congress for these. So again, what's the point of arguing for immigration reform if you're going to give us what we want already? The irony of that situation is that if you look at polling over the years, and you can go back 15, 20 years in the polling, and you frankly see, with some variations, the same thing over and over and over again, which is that generally when you ask people if they want immigration reform, you get 60% of the population saying yes. When you lay out what's actually included in immigration reform, and by that I mean including the compromises that we as advocates were willing to make, those numbers jump up to 80%. And by that, what I mean is when you say, okay, immigration reform, path to citizenship, 60%. Immigration reform, path to citizenship, with some increased enforcement, now it jumps up to 80%. And yet still we're never able to get immigration reform passed. And I really do think that part of the reason for that is because every time we've made a serious attempt, we've, again, given the house away beforehand. We have always increased the enforcement first and then tried to negotiate and then tried to compromise. And that is quite simply a recipe for disaster. And it has been a recipe for disaster for our communities, I think. And it also creates this sort of impression that, well, we should always be increasing enforcement. And, if anything else, regardless of whether we get anything else, like there's no reason not to increase enforcement. You people who want immigration reform, you're happy to increase enforcement anyway. So why don't we just keep increasing enforcement and keep increasing enforcement? And so that is what really gets us to a world where we have something like the One Beautiful Bill Act, which adds just an incredible amount of money to immigration enforcement. I mean, our enforcement now is better funded than the vast majority of militaries around the world, just for immigration enforcement, thanks to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so what we also see is folks, we see so much more attacks against us now. We see an administration now that is trying to label us advocates as extremists and as somehow dangerous. They've even said, we're taking away, sorry, I'm blanking on the student loan repayment. We're not helping on that anymore if you work for immigration advocates. They are trying to create this sense that we are somehow the danger to the country, as opposed to these people who, run roughshod over the Constitution. Somehow we are the ones who are using our free speech rights are the danger to the country somehow. And I'm just going to end with one little point I want to make that I think really demonstrates the way that this administration looks at immigration into the U.S. As many of you probably know right already, they are basically cutting off all refugee applications, all asylum applications, unless you're from South Africa, unless you're white from South Africa. Now, the irony about all this is that they claim repeatedly that, the vetting isn't good enough. We need to know more about these people who we're bringing into the country. And yet when you look at the reality, people who are normally applying or, trying to become refugees, trying to get their ability to come into the US, go through 2 years of vetting and background checks by over a dozen different federal agencies involved in that effort. Yet when this administration said we're going to bring in South Africans because they're supposedly being persecuted, white South Africans supposedly being persecuted, they didn't go through any vetting. They just said, we're going to bring these people in, and next thing you know, they're here. And I think that alone tells you really everything you need to know about the attitude of this administration and the way that they look at human beings and the way that they distinguish between human beings. This is clearly a very racist approach to immigration into the US. I am going to end it there. I haven't had a chance to actually look at any of the questions or see, but I believe Laura will be responding to a lot of questions, any that we got. I do appreciate everyone joining us today. We will be continuing this series weekly, so look out for a notice about next week's episode. We haven't decided yet what it'll be, but I'm sure it'll be fun and interesting. And again, thank you all for joining us. Hope you join us again in the future. Take care.